So instead of education being a public good or a right, it now becomes a market, right? A market that is marketed to particular groups, right? And other times marketed quite dubiously, right? So if we look in Chicago, there was a group of folks who were 4 neighborhoods, Kenwood, Oakland, Grand Boulevard, and Douglas, which are right just south of the Loop. And Renaissance 2010, that was the target area. So they were going to close 20 of the 22 schools that served that area and turn them into these 3 different categories. One was charter, one was performance, which had a little more autonomy in curriculum, and the other one was contract, which was kind of a slick way to do charters, because charters in Illinois are run through the state. But if you go the route of contract, you can run the contract with the city of Chicago. So that being said, they were going to close 20 of these 22 schools. Now, 10 of those schools were not underperforming, but they were being closed because the area was becoming gentrified, right? Because what do you have in Kenwood, Oakland, Grand Boulevard, and Douglas? You have access to rail service, you have access to 7 to 8 thoroughfares that take you directly into the central business district, and you have the lake, right? So, and that's prime property in Chicago, right? So now these schools, so a group of community organizations say, well, hold on, wait, they're closing 20 of our schools, 10 of them are not even underperforming. What's the deal here? So what we did as researchers, we said, well, let's look at new home development and demolition, right? So all we did, a woman named Rachel Weber, she just mapped out all the new homes that were scheduled to be built, and then she mapped out all the newest demolitions that were registered with the city of Chicago. Now, us as a sociologist, we look at the data and we find a 1-to-1 ratio. Where homes are being developed, you are getting a new school. Where land is being demolished, you are getting a new school. Again, who is affected here, right? We just got the pre-census data in Chicago, independent group of researchers. Chicago is at its lowest population since 1920, right? We lost 200,000 residents over the last 10 years. Now, the question is, and again, Chicago used to have one of the largest single public housing units in the world, known as the Robert Taylor homes. Now think about this, y'all. One of the largest public housing units in the world, right? 28 buildings, 14 floors, 22 units a floor, right? Right next to the Robert Taylor homes, you had Stateway Gardens, 8 buildings, 13 floors, 22 units a floor. Down the street, you had the Illinois Institute of Technology. Right next to that, you had the Dearborn homes, 20 buildings, 6 floors, 8 units a floor. Next to right across from the Dearborns, you had the Harold Ickes homes. The Harold Ickes homes had 8 buildings, 7 floors, 13 units a floor. Next to the Harold Ickes homes, you had the Hilliard homes that had 14 floors, right? 9 to 10 units a floor. Right? Right now, out of all 6 of those public housing units mentioned, how many stand? 1. Right? So the space housed over 250,000 people. They do not exist. One has been converted into luxury condos. You know, we get that language in Chicago. In Chicago, to dupe you, so if you all here in Boulder were moving to Chicago and you contacted a realtor, they would try to change the name of a neighborhood so you couldn't research and find out what it really was about, right? So that's what they would do. So they give these neighborhoods all these different names, and you say to yourself, what the hell is happening here, right? You know, Mid-South used to be called the Gap, right? Kenwood, Oakland, Grand Boulevard, right? Now it's the Gap. Now it's something Heights. You know, you tear down Cabrini Green homes and you create Cabrini Village, right? You know, it has to be this sexy, pristine sounding thing, right? And then you show the non-racially identified family. That's the new politics of race, right? Show people of color somewhat, right? You know, it's the racially ambiguous family. I'm sorry. The racially ambiguous family, right? And they kind of smiling, and then they got the kid that you really don't know. And then you say, oh, yeah, no, but they're not white, right? And then you got the random white dude on the side, like, right? I mean, it's a trip. I mean, and you see these posters, and you go to yourself, you say to yourself, damn, what was happening here, right? So what we know in Chicago's also a port of entry, right, for immigrant families. I was talking in Dr. Mazelle's class last night. Chicago has the second highest concentration of Polish people next to Warsaw, Poland, right? In fact, there's almost more Polish people per capita than there are in Warsaw, Poland in Chicago, right? So this whole notion around, you got Polish families, you got families from Western and Eastern Africa, you got families from Central and South America. Now they are skipping Chicago and relocating to the suburbs. So you had two suburbs that actually had, well, two counties, I should say, that had increases over the last 20 years of almost 25% in their population. Now, over 50% of families identified as Latino do not live in the city proper, but live in the suburbs. Now, you've destroyed public housing. Again, they call it a plan for transformation, and its notion around building mixed income developments. That's the other code word for you can't come. Because to live in mixed income developments in Chicago, if you're a former public housing resident, you could have particular provisions. One, like no one in your household could have a felony. Two, no one in your household can have a history of drug abuse. Three, to live in some of those mixed income developments, they will check the grades of your son or daughter, right? So I'm like, man, so what about the old white lady cocaine addict, right? Who gets through scot-free because she can pay market rate, right? But if you qualify in this low income space, now you have to go through all these requirements. So people are getting locked out, and the question becomes where they're going. Because what we're seeing now is schools are depopulating, right? And now when schools are being depopulated, they are closed and consolidated. We even have a name for it in Chicago. We call them receiver schools, right? So in these receiver schools, now it goes back to the same old adage, right? They're overcrowded, teachers are stressed, teachers are not supported, and they've been disinvested of resources. And I think that's a piece that we don't talk about. So we never talk about how a school becomes underperforming, right? We never talk about how disinvestment affects schools, right? We never talk about how what happens to a school when it has been historically under-resourced, right? So the bottom gets taken out of many places. I don't know if you all have this experience here in Colorado, but in some schools in Chicago, you can't take the books home for fear of theft. Now, if we know anything about young folks, the last thing on their mind is stealing a damn book. You know, there's no value on that on the block, right? You know, I can't hawk books out of my back trunk, right? But again, these policies that are based around assumption, right? And it becomes critically important to understand how that assumption now fuels policy, right? And Chicago being ground zero for this. So we see the same thing in New York City. You know, I'm walking down 125th, and I see a place called the Soha Cafe. And I'm saying to my New York homies, I'm saying, what the hell is a Soha? I said, oh, it's South Harlem. What the? Are you kidding me? You know, and then, you know, the rebel kicks in. I'm like, man, I'm about to kick in this window. Are you kidding me? What the hell is Soha? We're right across the street from the Carver homes. We're playing with me, right? But this type of indignation actually fuels me to think about my work in a particular way, right? So how is it, and a challenge to all of us in the room, right? How do we support critically justice efforts in education or in the law or in whatever discipline that you're in? How do we collectively support each other in that process? Who are the allies? Who are the enemies? And how do we actually realize this, not in terms of what Rita reminded us earlier, not in just these spaces of privilege, right? But in really understanding that there is a war condition here, right? And this war condition is affecting folks in very particular ways. In fact, there is an industry now that has made it its business to argue for the incarceration of young folks, right? And it's antithetical to what we know, right? So in the state of Illinois, I know you got similar numbers here. In the state of Illinois, on average, it costs about $7,500 to educate a young person, right? And that's a mean number because at the high school level is a little bit higher, the grade school level is a little bit lower. In the state of Illinois, it costs $33,000 to incarcerate an adult. But it gets deeper. In the state of Illinois, it costs $77,000 to incarcerate a young person, right? So think about that process. Think about the schools that we're in, right? So how are we actually thinking about it? So let's go back to this language of achievement gap. I'm going to challenge us to think about this a little differently, right? So we're talking about structural inequity, right? So not necessarily a gap, but I want to invoke the words of a prominent CRT scholar by the name of Gloria Ladson-Billings, and to talk about it as a debt. So we don't have an achievement gap. We have an educational debt. What is owed to the young people who have been historically underserved and disenfranchised in a space that has largely built themselves on the back of their ancestors? What are those young people owed? And again, if we frame our language, our policy language, in that area, what do we do knowing what we know? So if we know we have a debt to these young people because of, King talked about it a while back, a check mark, insufficient funds. Now, how do we educate them? Not just from an ideological perspective, but those young people as those who have the capacity to change our condition, right? Because they have this particular experience. So again, looking at that in a particular way. So how do we actually conceptualize educational debt relief, right? Because we got the Troubled Assets Relief Fund, also known as the bailout. We got the American Reinvestment Act that actually built roads over the last couple of years since the financial crisis, right? And we got loan restructuring for those who qualify, right, in terms of mortgages, right? But what if we reframe that to education and said, look, because we're in the tank, the best thing we could do longitudinally is invest in those who have historically had the least. But what does that mean? Those who historically have the least will challenge the system, the current system, to do things differently, right? But again, being very clear about this. So my attempt at trying to address this issue is saying, all right, well, look, there's a critical race theorist by the name of Eric Yamamoto. He says, look, we need to spend less time with abstract theory and more time with on-the-ground work, right? So every time I read that as a graduate student, I was like, oh, shit, this is the business. I don't have to go into class and just talk garbage about Foucault and Derrida, right? And I'm just like, man, who are these chumps, right? And, and we had that, and it's always this thing, right? Because in grad school, we often, and as faculty members, and faculty members can confess to this now, we in polite company, right? But this whole notion around, we have this to hell with grad school moment, right? If you're in law school, you got this to hell with law school. Man, fuck, this is some bullshit, right? You in the class, you're like, this is garbage, right? You in the grad school class in ed, you're like, man, dude, I'm about to walk out right now, right? Somebody about to get hit in the mouth, and it's not me, right? But this whole notion, so you have this moment. So I was having that moment, and I read Eric Yamamoto. I'm like, woo, this is the business. Okay. Now the question is, what does it look like?